Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? That strange sensation, as if something was lurking in the darkest corner of your room, just waiting for you to close your eyes? Now imagine that feeling isn't just a trick of your mind. What if something is actually there? It might sound crazy, but there are reports of people who, after staying awake for too many nights, started seeing things that shouldn't be there. Shadows moving on their own, reflections that don't match their movements, voices whispering their names in the dead of night. Coincidence? Or a sign that when we stay awake for too long, something from the other side notices us? And what if I told you that there's a story, real, disturbing, and impossible to forget, about someone who discovered this in the worst way possible? A story that will make you think twice before turning off the lights tonight. Press play, and find out why you can't sleep. Night fell, and with it, absolute silence. He lay down, expecting sleep to come as usual, but something felt different. The pillow seemed uncomfortable, the mattress harder than normal. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder, as if each second echoed through the room. He tossed and turned, trying to find a comfortable position, but his body simply wouldn't shut down. Time passed, and the unease grew. The ceiling fan spun slowly, and in its monotonous hum, he could almost hear a faint whisper. He looked toward the window and saw only darkness outside, yet he had the eerie feeling that someone was looking in. He swallowed hard, turned to his side, and squeezed his eyes shut. The world was too quiet. Too quiet in a way that felt wrong. And then, he heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the corner of the room. Like something shifting in the darkness, ever so slightly. His heart pounded, and involuntarily, he held his breath. He tried to convince himself it was just the house settling, just a normal sound. But still, he couldn't bring himself to turn his head and look. The clock read 3:27 a.m., and sleep was nowhere in sight. His eyes burned, his head throbbed, and every shadow in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. He blinked a few times, trying to focus on the darkness, and that's when he noticed it. Something had moved. It wasn't a trick of his mind, it wasn't his imagination. An object on his desk, the glass of water he had left there, had shifted a few inches on its own. A shiver crawled down his spine, and an instinct deep inside screamed at him not to look again. But curiosity overpowered fear. He rubbed his eyes and glanced back at the glass. Maybe he was just too tired and had imagined it. But when his gaze flickered to the mirror on the wardrobe, his stomach dropped. For a split second, he was certain something had passed behind him, too fast to be a trick of the light. His heart pounded against his ribs. The exhaustion was taking its toll, and he started questioning whether this was just sleep deprivation messing with him. He decided to turn on the TV to distract his mind, but the screen only showed a strange static. And then for an instant, between the flickering pixels, he saw something reflected, a silhouette standing at his door watching him. He blinked, and the image was gone. But the feeling that he was no longer alone remained. Morning arrived, but rest never came. He had spent the entire night with his eyes wide open, his body begging for sleep, but his mind refusing to shut down. When he got out of bed, his legs felt weak, as if he were sedated. He walked to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and slowly lifted his head to look in the mirror. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, his lips dry. But something was wrong. His reflection seemed slightly delayed. Small details, barely noticeable, but enough to make his stomach turn. He blinked, and in the mirror, he blinked a fraction of a second later. A tiny delay, but enough to paralyze him. His heart started racing. Maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him. He moved his hand, and the reflection mimicked him. But the smile that formed on his reflection's lips was not his. It was subtle, crooked, an expression he hadn't made. He felt a lump in his throat and took a step back, his eyes still locked on the mirror. The air in the bathroom seemed heavier. The light flickered. For a second, he was sure that the reflection had not blinked with him. As if that thing in the mirror was no longer bound by the same rules. Swallowing hard, he turned around and rushed out of the bathroom, feeling an unnatural chill running down his spine. But before shutting the door, he stole one last glance at the mirror. And the reflection was still there, staring straight at him, even though he had already turned away. The rest of the day passed in a blur. He avoided mirrors, avoided thinking about what he had seen. But as night approached, the fear grew. The sun set, and once again, he found himself alone in the dark room. He tried to convince himself it was just exhaustion, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But as he switched off the lights, a chilling thought crept into his mind. What if that reflection wasn't just a reflection? Midnight arrived, and with it, the strange noises. That same sound coming from the corner of the room. But this time, he found the courage to look. And he instantly regretted it. In the wardrobe mirror, a dark figure stood motionless. There was no one in the room. But the mirror reflected something that should not be there. The minutes dragged on. He pulled the blanket over his head, trying to block out the presence. But then, the sound returned. Closer this time. Something was scratching against the wardrobe's wooden surface. A slow, drawn-out scraping, like fingernails dragging along the wood. And then, silence. But in that silence, a new sound emerged. A low, raspy whisper, coming directly from the mirror. "I know you're awake." His heart nearly stopped. The terror was suffocating, his eyes wide open in the darkness. He didn't know what to do. But one thing was certain, he could not look again. Sleep never came. He lay frozen in bed, breathing slowly, trying to convince himself that it was all in his head. But as the house fell into absolute silence, the noise returned. A dry creak. Wood shifting under weight. Coming from the hallway. He held his breath. Another creak. Then another. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, stepping carefully on the wooden floor. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He wanted to believe it was just the wind, maybe an old piece of furniture settling. But these footsteps had a rhythm, an intention, as if someone was walking through the dark, stopping right in front of his door. Silence. And then, knock, knock, knock. 3 soft knocks on the wood. The sound sent shivers down his spine. Who, or what, was there? He shut his eyes tightly, pretending to be asleep, as if that would protect him. But then, something happened that made his blood run cold. A deep, heavy breathing, coming from the other side of the door. It was long, slow rasping, like someone standing right outside, just waiting. He could hear it clearly, feel its presence. Then, the doorknob turned. The metal handle twisted slowly, creaking as it moved. But the door didn't open. Just a quiet click, as if something was testing if it was unlocked. Sweat dripped down his forehead. His mind screamed that this couldn't be real, that he had to be imagining it. Then, the worst thing happened. The breathing was now coming from inside the room. Not from the door. From behind him. The air grew thick, the atmosphere dense like a suffocating nightmare. He felt the mattress shift near his feet, as if something had climbed onto the bed. But he didn't dare open his eyes. Every muscle in his body locked in place. Then, he felt it. A weight pressing down on his leg. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. Like fingers pressing through the blanket, testing his presence. The weight moved up slowly, crawling towards his waist. The breathing grew closer. Hot. Too close to his ear. And then, a voice. Low. Guttural. Scratched like a blade against stone. "Can you hear me?" He didn't answer. He couldn't answer. The world around him spun. Every cell in his body screamed to remain still, to pretend none of this was happening. He tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Then, the weight lifted. In an instant, the presence was gone. The room returned to its suffocating silence. He waited. 1 minute. 2. 3. Nothing happened. Maybe it was over. Maybe it really was just his mind. But then when he finally opened his eyes, he saw something on the ceiling. 2 pale hands, with long dirty nails, clutching the sides of the light fixture. And just above them, 2 black hollow eyes staring directly at him. His breath hitched. The room was dark, but those eyes were darker. 2 hollow pits, deep and endless, that never blinked. His blood turned to ice. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but his body was paralyzed with fear. All he could do was stare back. The dim glow of the bedside lamp flickered weakly, casting brief flashes of light across the ceiling. And for a fraction of a second, he saw the creature more clearly. It clung to the ceiling like an insect, its limbs stretched and unnatural, its head tilted at an impossible angle. The lamp flickered again. And then it was gone. But the terror didn't leave. That heavy, invisible weight pressing down on him remained. He wasn't alone. The next day passed in a blur. He barely spoke. Barely ate. But something was wrong. People started looking at him differently. On the street, at the store, even at work. Their gazes lingered just a second too long. As if they knew something he didn't. Then night returned. And with it, the fear. This time, there were no footsteps. No whispers. Just the overwhelming feeling that something was there. Waiting. Watching. The darkness felt deeper. The silence heavier. He knew something had changed. And then, in the dead of night, his phone vibrated. A single notification. No sender. No number. Just a message on the screen. "Why won't you sleep?" His heart slammed against his ribs. His hands trembled as he unlocked the phone. But there was nothing. No message. No number. As if it had never existed. But before he could process what was happening, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air turned thick. The darkness got darker. And then, in that crushing silence, he heard something that made his stomach drop. A soft click. The sound of a camera taking a picture. From somewhere in the room. In the darkness. Right next to him. The click echoed through the silence like a thunderclap. Someone, or something, had just taken a picture inside his room. His heart nearly stopped. There was no one else there. Or was there? Trembling, he fumbled for his phone on the nightstand, his sweaty fingers struggling to grip it. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow in the darkness. No new messages. No notifications. But then, his stomach twisted. The photo gallery app now showed a new image. He hesitated. His finger hovered over the screen, his breath shaky. Part of him wanted to ignore it, throw the phone away, run. But the fear of the unknown was worse than the truth. He tapped the image. The photo loaded slowly. It was his room, taken from the foot of his bed. The dim light of the bedside lamp barely illuminated the scene. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. But then, his eyes adjusted. His breath caught in his throat. In the center of the photo stood a silhouette. Tall. Black. Watching him. No face. No features. Just a shadowy figure standing in his room, staring at him while he slept. His stomach twisted in knots. A wave of nausea rolled over him. His fingers swiped to the next photo. Now, the figure was closer. He wanted to stop. But something made him swipe again. The next image sent a jolt of sheer terror through his body. The face of the shadow was right in front of his. Or rather, where a face should have been. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an empty void, as if the darkness itself had taken form. His phone vibrated again. A new message appeared on the screen. No number. No sender. Just 2 words. "Did you like it?" The phone slipped from his hands. His skin crawled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Someone had been inside his room. Someone had been watching him. His mind raced for explanations, grasping at anything rational. But then, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The pictures weren't taken from inside the room. They were taken from inside the mirror. His breathing turned shallow. His hands trembled. He slowly turned his head toward the wardrobe mirror. And there it was. A shadowy figure inside the reflection, grinning. And then slowly, it raised a hand. And waved. Terror locked every muscle in his body. The thing inside the mirror was moving on its own. The reflection was no longer just a copy, it was alive. It raised a hand and waved at him with a wide, unnatural grin, as if it knew he couldn't escape. His instinct screamed for him to get up, to run, to do anything. But then, the worst thing happened. He couldn't move. His entire body was frozen in place. He tried to lift his arm, turn his head, even blink, but nothing worked. The only thing he could do was breathe, and even that felt difficult. It was as if something unseen was pressing against his chest, holding him down. Then, inside the mirror, the thing took a step forward. His eyes widened in horror, but his body remained paralyzed. He was forced to watch as the creature, which had once been just a distorted reflection, moved closer to the glass. And then, it started scratching. Scrape. 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 The sound was unbearable, a sharp screeching noise that felt like nails digging into his skull. The thing was scratching the mirror from the inside. Then it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. And then, with a sudden movement, it raised its hand and knocked. Tap. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. The thing knocked again. Tap. Tap. Harder this time. Faster. The mirror vibrated under the force, and a small crack began to spread across the surface. It was trying to get out. Panic surged through his veins. His mind screamed that if it broke through, if it escaped, something far worse would happen. Then, suddenly, the knocking stopped. Silence. The mirror returned to normal. His reflection was just his reflection again. No cracks. No shadowy figure. Nothing. Had it all been in his mind? Then, a whisper. Low. Muffled. But unmistakably coming from inside the mirror. Next time. I'm coming through. It was the last thing he heard before everything went black. The world around him dissolved into a vast, empty void. He had blacked out. Or at least, he thought he had. But when he opened his eyes, he realized he was no longer in his room. The place around him was endless and suffocating, a corridor stretching into infinity, bathed in a sickly pale light. The walls pulsed faintly, as if they were alive, as if they were breathing. The air was thick with the stench of damp earth and something rotten. He tried to step forward, but his feet sank slightly into the floor. It felt like flesh. Terror crawled up his spine. He tried to remember how he had gotten there, but his thoughts were fragmented, as if his mind was caught between sleep and reality. He knew this was a dream. But at the same time, something inside him screamed that it wasn't. Then, he heard it. A whisper. Distant at first, almost inaudible. But getting closer. He turned his head slowly, heart pounding. And there it was. A silhouette at the end of the corridor. Tall, thin, hunched, with arms far too long for a human. It didn't move. It just watched. The air thickened, pressing down on him like a heavy weight. Time felt distorted, stretched, as if something unseen was controlling every second. Then, the thing took its first step. His breath hitched. The steps were wrong. They weren't normal footsteps. Each movement made a wet, crunching noise, like bones snapping inside decayed flesh. He tried to run, but his body didn't respond. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The terror consumed him as the figure kept coming, faster now, closer. Then, the world shifted. Suddenly, he was back in his room. But something was off. Very off. The air was heavy. The glow from his bedside lamp flickered weakly, barely holding back the darkness. The clock on the wall read 3:33 a.m. His skin felt clammy, drenched in sweat. Was it just a dream? Or was it something more? Then, he noticed something that made his stomach churn. His bed sheets were dirty, stained with damp earth. And beside the bed, there were footprints. Footprints leading into the room. But none leading out. The world blurred around him. He could no longer tell if it was day or night. Time slipped through his fingers like sand, impossible to hold on to. The clock showed times that didn't make sense. 3:33 a.m. 6 hours 66 minutes, 25:07. But that wasn't possible, was it? Time wasn't moving in a straight line anymore. He blinked, and suddenly he was at work, but had no memory of leaving his house. He blinked again, and he was back in his bedroom, with no recollection of how he got there. The world around him felt bent, distorted. Like a scratched record, skipping, repeating, jumping ahead. And then, the notes started appearing. Scraps of paper, written in his own handwriting, scattered around the house. Some on his desk. Others taped to the bathroom mirror. One folded inside his pocket, as if he had placed it there himself. But he had no memory of writing any of them. The messages were short, direct, and terrifying. Don't look at the corner of the room. Don't answer if the phone rings at 3:33 a.m. If you hear someone call your name, pretend you didn't. It's getting closer. Panic settled deep in his gut. He was leaving messages for himself. But why? How had he written them without remembering? And the worst question of all, had he already broken any of these rules? The phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the silence like a knife. His heart nearly stopped. The screen glowed in the dark. 3:33 a.m. He held his breath. The note said not to answer. But what if it was important? What if it was his only chance to understand what was happening? His hand shook as he picked up the phone. The screen didn't show a number. Just one word. You. The air turned ice cold. Was he calling himself? The ringing stopped. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. But before he could react, his phone vibrated again. A new message flashed on the screen. No sender. No number. Just a single sentence. Why do you keep ignoring me? The silence after the message was unbearable. He could feel the weight of the darkness around him, pressing down like an invisible force. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch and shift on its own. His phone still trembled in his sweaty hand. He wanted to turn it off, throw it away, destroy it, but deep inside, he knew it wouldn't make a difference. The feeling of being watched had never been this intense. It was as if something was there, standing in the darkest corner of the room, just waiting for him to notice. But waiting for what? He tried to look away, tried to pretend nothing was wrong. But then, the sounds came back. Tick, tick, tick. Long, sharp nails scraping against the wall. Slow, deliberate, like it wanted him to hear. His body tensed, his breath shallow. Then came the smell. Something rotten. Like meat left out in the sun for too long, mixed with damp soil. The stench invaded his nostrils, thick and suffocating. He covered his mouth, fighting back the urge to gag. Whatever it was close. The room turned freezing. The bedside lamp flickered 3 times, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed everything. And then he heard it. Breathing. Deep. Slow. Coming from the side of the bed. He was no longer alone. Instinct screamed at him not to look. But something stronger, maybe desperation, maybe madness, forced him to turn his head. And there it was. In the corner of the room, 2 pale hands emerged from the shadows. Long, twisted fingers pressed against the floor, as if something was crawling out of the darkness. Then, the eyes appeared. 2 empty, black voids, locked onto him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His chest tightened. The air thickened. The thing moved. The floor creaked. It was coming. The creature moved again, and the floor groaned under its weight. It was real. This wasn't a dream, it wasn't just sleep deprivation playing tricks on him. It was in the room. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but his body was frozen in place, paralyzed by a terror he had never felt before. The bedside lamp flickered weakly, casting sporadic flashes of light across the room. And for a brief moment, he saw it more clearly. Its arms were too long. Its skin, pale and stretched over bones that didn't belong to anything human. But the worst part was its eyes, black hollow, staring straight into his soul. The lamp flickered one last time. Then, it went out completely. The room was swallowed by absolute darkness. A suffocating, overwhelming blackness. He held his breath, his muscles tensed to the point of pain. Something was moving in the shadows. Soft, deliberate footsteps approached the bed. Panic surged through his veins. He lunged for the light switch on the wall, his fingers trembling. He pressed it. Click. Nothing. Click. Click. Still nothing. A cold realization set in. The power was gone. Desperation kicked in. He scrambled for his phone on the nightstand, pressing the power button frantically. The screen flickered for a second, then died. His battery was full. But the phone wouldn't turn on. And then, the truth hit him. The lights weren't just going out. The thing was feeding on the darkness. The presence got closer. He could feel it, standing right beside the bed. Then, the mattress dipped. It was climbing onto the bed. Panic erupted inside him like wildfire. He wanted to run, to fight, but then, cold bony fingers wrapped around his ankles. The touch was like ice, like the grip of something long dead. He tried to kick, but the fingers tightened. And then, in the suffocating darkness, a voice, low, guttural, and broken, whispered right beside his ear. "Can you see me now?" The whole room trembled. And he was pulled into the darkness. The pull was so strong that it knocked the air from his lungs. The darkness swallowed him completely. The room vanished. The world vanished. There was only the void. He kept falling. An endless descent into nothingness. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body twisted in every direction, as if he were trapped in an invisible current. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. Where was he? What was happening? Then, everything stopped. His eyes snapped open. He was back in his room. But something was wrong. Very wrong. The air felt thick and suffocating, as if he were breathing something dense. The walls looked distorted. The clock on the wall read midnight. But the hands weren't moving. Nothing was moving. Slowly, he sat up. Everything looked the same, but this wasn't his room. It was like a perfect replica, a hollow copy of reality. The place felt dead. No sound. No air. No sign of life. Then, he noticed it. The wardrobe mirror was open. And his reflection was missing. His stomach twisted. He looked straight at the glass. But there was nothing staring back at him. The mirror reflected the room, but not him. As if he no longer existed. Then, his blood ran cold. His reflection was in bed. Lying down. Sleeping. Panic surged through him. His brain struggled to make sense of it. He was still there. But on the other side. Like he had been swapped. And then, the reflection opened its eyes. And smiled. Terror crashed into him like a wave. The reflection sat up, staring directly at him. The grin was wide, unnatural, something his face was never meant to do. Then it spoke. Now I am you. The bedside lamp flickered. He was back in his room. The mirror was normal. His reflection was there, still pale, exactly as it should be. But deep inside, he knew something was wrong. His phone vibrated. A new message. No sender. No number. Just a short phrase on the screen. Sleep well. Then, the clock resumed ticking. 3:34 a.m. He couldn't remember the last hour. What had happened in that darkness? And worse, was he still himself?